Late September 1945. The air over Yokohama still carries the faint smell of ash and salt. Entire districts lie flattened, their wooden frames burned into dark outlines against the ground. Where streets once intersected, only narrow paths remain, clear by hand, by shovel, by memory. An American Jeep moves slowly through the ruins, its tires crunching over broken tile and glass. The soldiers inside wear fresh uniforms, but their boots are already dusted with the gray of a defeated empire. They pass women carrying water in metal buckets. Children stop and stare. No one speaks. Since the surrender on August 15th, the city has lived in a quiet tension. The war is over, but its presence lingers in every burned home and shuttered shop. U.S. occupation units now move through neighborhoods cataloging property, documenting damage, and returning items gathered during evacuations and searches, photographs, documents, fragments of ordinary lives. In doorways and alleyways, civilians wait as unfamiliar trucks arrive, carrying boxes labeled in English and Japanese. Inside them are pieces of the past, preserved through fire and collapse. For many families, the war ended with silence. For others, it ended when something lost was placed back into their hands, small proof that life before the bombing had truly existed. And in the weeks that followed, these quiet exchanges would become some of the first fragile bridges between former enemies. By the summer of 1945, Japan stood at the edge of total collapse. For nearly 4 years, the Pacific War had expanded across oceans and islands, drawing the empire into a widening conflict against the United States and its allies. What began in December 1941 with the attack on Pearl Harbor had, by 1945, become a war fought increasingly over Japanese soil itself. American strategy shifted steadily toward direct pressure on the Japanese home islands. After capturing key positions across the Pacific, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, U.S. forces gained airfields close enough to launch sustained bombing campaigns. Beginning in late 1944 and intensifying in early 1945, B-29 bombers conducted large-scale air raids over major Japanese cities. These raids targeted industrial districts, transportation networks, and urban infrastructure that supported the war effort. The bombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945 became one of the most devastating air attacks in history. Firebombing raids using incendiary munitions ignited dense wooden neighborhoods, producing firestorms that spread rapidly through civilian areas. Similar raids struck Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, and dozens of other cities. Entire districts were reduced to ash. Millions of civilians were displaced, and housing shortages became severe across the country. As conditions worsened, Japanese authorities organized mass evacuations. Children were sent to rural areas. Families buried valuables beneath homes or entrusted them to relatives. Important documents, family registers, letters, marriage certificates, photographs, were hidden in walls, gardens, or wrapped carefully and stored in small containers. These items represented continuity in a society where identity and lineage carried deep significance. Food shortages intensified through 1945. Transportation networks were damaged, and shipping lanes were disrupted by Allied naval blockades. Urban populations faced rationing, and many relied on barter or small gardens for survival. Women, particularly in cities, carried much of the burden of maintaining households amid scarcity. With many men serving in the military or already lost in combat, civilian life became increasingly fragile. Meanwhile, American military planners prepared for a possible invasion of the Japanese home islands. Operations scheduled for late 1945 and early 1946 projected heavy casualties on both sides. But events in August 1945 changed the course of the war abruptly. On August 6th and August 9th, atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan and advanced into Manchuria. Facing overwhelming military and economic collapse, Japan's leadership moved toward surrender. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation by radio. For many civilians, it was the first time they had heard his voice. The message confirmed what many already feared. The war had ended, and Japan had accepted Allied terms. The broadcast did not contain dramatic language of defeat, but its meaning was unmistakable. The empire that had mobilized society for total war had now entered a new and uncertain phase. In the days that followed, confusion and caution dominated daily life. Some Japanese civilians feared occupation forces would bring retaliation or harsh reprisals. Propaganda during the war had portrayed American troops as brutal and unforgiving. Others simply did not know what to expect. Cities lay in ruins, infrastructure was damaged, and communication systems were unreliable. American occupation forces began arriving in late August and early September 1945. Their mission extended beyond military control. Under the leadership of General Douglas MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP, the occupation would oversee demilitarization, political restructuring, and economic recovery. But in the earliest weeks, the most visible presence of the occupation was practical and immediate. Patrols moving through damaged cities, establishing order, assessing needs, and documenting the condition of neighborhoods. U.S. units conducted surveys of destroyed areas and cataloged abandoned or recovered property. Items collected during evacuations, civil defense efforts, or wartime relocations were sometimes stored in municipal facilities or temporary depots. In the aftermath of bombing raids, soldiers and local officials encountered personal belongings scattered across ruins. Letters, identification papers, photographs, and household items. These objects were often gathered and logged, when possible, then redistributed through local administrative offices once stability improved. For civilians returning to damaged homes, these efforts held quiet importance. The war had erased physical spaces and disrupted families. Documents and photographs became essential proof of identity and continuity. In a society rebuilding itself amid defeat, the return of even small personal items could mark the beginning of normal life again. By September 1945, American vehicles moved cautiously through urban districts that were still clearing debris. Civilians watched from doorways and narrow streets. Exchanges were brief, often formal, sometimes wordless. Yet they carried symbolic weight. For the first time, former enemies stood face to face not on battlefields, but in neighborhoods trying to recover from war. The occupation had only just begun. Its policies, routines, and human interactions were still taking shape. And in the weeks ahead, these small moments of contact would help define how two nations, once locked in total war, began to navigate the uncertain peace that followed. When Allied occupation forces entered Japan in late August and early September 1945, their arrival marked the first time in the nation's modern history that foreign troops would exercise sustained authority on Japanese soil. The transition from wartime mobilization to occupation governance occurred quickly, but its emotional and social impact unfolded more slowly. Civilians who had spent years under strict wartime discipline now faced a new and unfamiliar reality, one shaped by foreign uniforms, new rules, and the sudden end of imperial war. The occupation was organized under the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, headquartered in Tokyo. General Douglas MacArthur oversaw a complex administration tasked with demilitarizing Japan, dismantling its wartime leadership structures, and initiating political and economic reforms. Yet for ordinary civilians, the earliest interactions with occupation forces did not take place in government buildings or formal ceremonies. They occurred in streets, neighborhoods, and temporary administrative offices where daily life was being reconstructed piece by piece. Japanese municipal authorities, many of whom had remained in place after surrender, worked alongside occupation personnel to restore order. Police stations reopened. Local registries began functioning again. Schools and clinics attempted to resume operations despite severe shortages of supplies. Communication between civilians and occupation officials was often mediated by interpreters or bilingual staff, and misunderstandings were common in the early weeks. One of the practical challenges facing both sides was the management of property left behind during evacuations and air raids. Throughout the final months of the war, civil defense groups and neighborhood associations had attempted to preserve important items when families were forced to leave their homes. Documents proving identity, family registers, land deeds, and marriage records were considered especially important. Photographs, though not legally essential, carried deep personal significance. They represented family continuity, memory, and connection to a life that many feared had been erased by bombing and displacement. After surrender, occupation authorities encouraged the collection and cataloging of scattered property when possible. In some areas, local offices stored items recovered from damaged homes or public shelters. These collections included letters, framed photographs, personal papers, and small household objects. The process was uneven. In cities heavily damaged by firebombing, entire neighborhoods had burned so completely that little remained. But in other districts, particularly those on the outskirts of major cities, objects survived in storage or under rubble. American units assigned to civil affairs and military government roles often participated in these efforts. Their responsibilities extended beyond maintaining order. They were instructed to support stabilization and assist local administrations in resuming basic functions. This sometimes included facilitating the return of property that could be identified and matched with owners. Such actions were not large-scale operations in the early weeks. They were local, incremental efforts shaped by available records and community knowledge. For many Japanese civilians, especially women managing households in the absence of men lost or still missing in the war, the retrieval of personal belongings carried emotional weight. Marriage documents and photographs symbolized family continuity in a time when social structures had been disrupted. Weddings in pre-war and wartime Japan were often formal occasions recorded in studio photographs. These images were displayed in homes as markers of family identity and status. Losing them meant losing a tangible link to the past. At the same time, cultural distance between occupiers and civilians remained significant. Japanese society had emphasized hierarchy, discipline, and national unity during the war years. The sudden presence of foreign soldiers, some of whom were only slightly older than the civilians they encountered, created a complex atmosphere. Civilians were cautious. Many avoided direct eye contact or conversation. Occupation troops, for their part, operated under strict regulations designed to maintain discipline and prevent misconduct. They were instructed to behave professionally and avoid unnecessary confrontation with civilians. Despite this caution, everyday interactions slowly became more common. Soldiers purchased goods from local vendors when available. Children sometimes approached vehicles out of curiosity. Interpreters helped facilitate communication in markets and administrative offices. Over time, practical exchanges replaced initial fear. The return of personal items, whether documents, tools, or photographs, became part of this evolving relationship. Food shortages and housing crises continued to shape daily life. Urban residents often lived in temporary shelters or partially repaired homes. Women stood in ration lines or traveled to rural areas to barter for food. Occupation authorities introduced reforms aimed at stabilizing the economy and improving distribution systems, but recovery would take years. In this environment, even small gestures carried symbolic meaning. The return of a document confirming a marriage or a photograph recovered from a damaged home could provide reassurance in a period marked by uncertainty. As autumn turned toward winter in 1945, the routines of occupation administration became more structured. Property return efforts, though limited by available records and resources, continued at the local level. Lists were posted. Civilians visited offices to search for familiar items. Some found nothing. Others recovered fragments of their previous lives, objects that had survived when buildings and neighborhoods had not. These moments did not change the broader realities of defeat and reconstruction. Japan remained under occupation. Its cities required rebuilding. Its political and social systems were undergoing transformation. Yet within this larger historical process, the quiet return of personal belongings represented one of the earliest forms of contact between former enemies. A contact defined not by combat, but by the shared recognition that war had disrupted ordinary lives on both sides. And as these small exchanges accumulated across neighborhoods and towns, they began to shape the human dimension of occupation, one that would influence how civilians and soldiers perceived each other in the months and years that followed. Angle 1. The civilian experience. In the weeks after surrender, daily life for Japanese civilians was defined by uncertainty and adaptation. Cities had been burned, transportation systems disrupted, and supply chains fractured. Many families returned to neighborhoods where only foundations and scattered debris remained. The routines that had structured life before the war, work, school, household duties, had to be rebuilt from almost nothing. Women carried much of this responsibility. With large numbers of men dead, missing, or still overseas awaiting repatriation, households often depended on mothers, daughters, and widows to secure food, repair shelters, and maintain family records. These records were more than administrative necessities. In Japan's family registry system, documents confirming marriage, lineage, and residence defined legal identity. Without them, rebuilding normal life became difficult. When occupation forces and local offices began returning recovered items, the process was quiet and procedural. Notices appeared on bulletin boards listing items found during cleanup operations. Civilians visited municipal offices, sometimes waiting in line for hours to search through boxes of documents and photographs. The atmosphere inside these rooms was subdued. People spoke softly, often bowing in acknowledgement rather than conversation. For many, the search ended in disappointment. Entire districts had burned beyond recovery. But for some families, fragments of the past survived. Letters tied with string, photographs curled at the edges from heat, certificates wrapped in cloth. These objects had endured when homes had not. Their return marked a small, but meaningful step toward stability. Emotional responses varied. Some civilians remained reserved, adhering to cultural norms of restraint. Others showed visible relief when a familiar object was placed back in their hands. In a society where public displays of emotion were often controlled, even quiet gestures carried significance. A bowed head, a prolonged silence, or hands carefully unfolding a photograph could express what words did not. The experience was not uniform across Japan. In heavily damaged cities, recovery efforts were limited. In smaller towns and less affected districts, more property could be identified and returned. Yet across regions, the underlying pattern remained the same. Civilians seeking continuity in a landscape where physical and social structures had been disrupted. These encounters also marked some of the earliest direct interactions between Japanese civilians and American soldiers outside formal ceremonies. They were brief and practical, shaped by necessity rather than ceremony. But they introduced a new reality, one in which former enemies met not in battle, but in administrative offices and damaged neighborhoods where daily life was being reconstructed. Angle 2. The U.S. soldier's perspective. For American troops arriving in Japan in late 1945, the occupation presented a different kind of military duty. Many had spent years in combat across the Pacific, on islands like Guadalcanal, Saipan, or Okinawa. Others had trained for an invasion of Japan that never occurred. Instead of preparing for battle, they now found themselves tasked with maintaining order and supporting reconstruction in a defeated nation. Occupation regulations emphasized discipline and restraint. Soldiers were instructed to avoid unnecessary confrontation and to respect civilian property when possible. The objective was to stabilize Japan quickly and prevent unrest. Civil affairs units worked closely with local authorities to manage food distribution, transportation, and housing. In this context, returning personal belongings to civilians became part of a broader effort to restore normalcy. Many soldiers encountered a Japan very different from wartime propaganda images. Instead of hostile resistance, they found cities struggling to recover and civilians focused on survival. Burned neighborhoods and damaged infrastructure made a strong impression. Some soldiers wrote in letters home about the scale of destruction and the quiet demeanor of the population. The war had ended, but its physical and emotional consequences were visible everywhere. Interactions with civilians during property return efforts were typically brief and formal. Language barriers limited conversation. Interpreters or bilingual officials facilitated communication when necessary. Soldiers might hand over documents or photographs recovered during cleanup operations, then move on to the next task. Yet even these short exchanges carried symbolic weight. They represented a shift from combat to administration, from destroying infrastructure to helping stabilize it. For many American servicemen, the occupation offered a different perspective on the war they had fought. Seeing civilian life up close, families rebuilding homes, children attending reopened schools, women managing households, added complexity to their understanding of the conflict's aftermath. While military objectives remained primary, these everyday interactions introduced a human dimension that differed from battlefield experience. At the same time, soldiers remained aware of their role as representatives of an occupying force. They operated under strict rules designed to prevent misconduct and maintain authority. Professional distance was expected. Yet within that framework, routine tasks such as returning personal belongings contributed to an atmosphere of gradual normalization. Over time, these small actions helped establish patterns of interaction that would define the occupation's early months. Angle 3. Cultural distance and gradual contact. The first encounters between Japanese civilians and American soldiers took place across a significant cultural divide. Wartime propaganda on both sides had emphasized difference and hostility. Civilians had been warned to expect harsh treatment from occupying forces. American troops had been trained to anticipate resistance. When neither scenario fully materialized in many areas, the resulting interactions were cautious but revealing. Body language often replaced conversation. Civilians bowed slightly in acknowledgement. Soldiers responded with nods or brief gestures. Interpreters facilitated necessary exchanges, but much communication remained nonverbal. The return of personal belongings provided a context for these interactions. It allowed contact to occur within a structured, practical framework rather than in formal social settings. Over time, repeated encounters reduced some of the initial tension. Civilians became accustomed to the presence of occupation patrols. Soldiers grew familiar with local routines. Markets reopened. Public transportation resumed in limited form. Administrative offices handling property returns became regular points of contact. Each exchange, however small, contributed to a gradual adjustment on both sides. These moments did not erase the realities of defeat or occupation. Japan remained under foreign military control, and the broader political and social transformations underway were profound. Yet at the level of everyday experience, the return of documents, photographs, and personal items introduced a different kind of interaction, one defined by routine, necessity, and a shared goal of rebuilding stability. As these patterns developed, they revealed multiple dimensions of the occupation experience: human, administrative, cultural, and psychological. And taken together, they began to shape how both civilians and soldiers understood the transition from war to peace in the closing months of 1945. Angle 4. Leadership and occupation policy. The early months of the Allied occupation were shaped by a deliberate balance between authority and stabilization. Under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, the Supreme Commander for the Allied powers established policies intended to demilitarize Japan while preventing chaos. The destruction of infrastructure and the scale of civilian hardship required careful management. A harsh or punitive occupation risked destabilizing an already fragile society. Occupation leadership emphasized order, discipline, and controlled reform. Military units were instructed to maintain professional conduct and to avoid actions that could provoke resentment or unrest. Civil affairs divisions worked closely with surviving Japanese administrative structures, relying on local officials to maintain continuity in governance. This approach allowed for the rapid restoration of municipal functions, police services, registries, and public utilities, even as broader political changes were introduced. Within this framework, seemingly small actions carried strategic importance. The return of personal property, when possible, reinforced the message that the occupation sought stability rather than indiscriminate punishment. Documents confirming identity or marriage helped civilians navigate administrative systems that were being reorganized. Photographs and personal items, though not essential to governance, symbolized a degree of respect for civilian life. These actions were not central directives from high command, but rather extensions of broader policy goals. Civil affairs officers were encouraged to support local recovery efforts and to demonstrate predictable, regulated behavior. In practice, this meant assisting with tasks that restored normal routines. Each instance of returned property contributed to a perception, carefully cultivated by occupation leadership, that order was replacing wartime disruption. This approach aligned with larger strategic objectives. The United States and its allies sought to transform Japan into a stable, demilitarized state aligned with post-war international structures. Achieving that goal required cooperation from the civilian population. Policies that minimized friction and supported recovery helped establish conditions for political and economic reform. Leadership decisions at the highest levels thus filtered down into everyday interactions in neighborhoods and administrative offices. When soldiers handed back documents or personal belongings, they were participating, consciously or not, in a broader strategy aimed at reshaping the relationship between occupier and occupied. Angle 5. Symbolism of personal belongings. In post-war Japan, personal objects often carried meanings far beyond their material value. A photograph taken before the war might represent family continuity across generations. A marriage certificate confirmed legal and social bonds in a system where household registration defined identity. Letters preserved connections to relatives separated by military service or displacement. The destruction of cities during the bombing campaigns threatened not only physical structures, but also these symbols of continuity. When homes burned, so did records of family history. The loss was practical and emotional. Without documents, proving identity or property ownership became difficult. Without photographs, memories of pre-war life became less tangible. When such items were recovered and returned, their significance extended beyond administrative convenience. They served as evidence that parts of the past had survived. In a society rebuilding itself amid defeat, these fragments helped anchor individuals to a sense of continuity. The return of a single photograph might not change material conditions, but it could affirm that personal history had not been entirely erased by war. American soldiers and civil affairs personnel may not always have fully understood the cultural weight attached to these items. Yet their actions in cataloging and returning property contributed to a process through which civilians reassembled elements of their former lives. These exchanges remained quiet and procedural. There were no formal ceremonies, but their cumulative effect helped establish a pattern of interaction based on practical assistance rather than confrontation. The symbolism also worked in the opposite direction. For occupation troops, handing back personal belongings reinforced a sense that their role had shifted from combat to administration. It provided a tangible contrast to the destruction of war. Instead of seizing territory, they were helping restore fragments of everyday life. This contrast did not erase memories of combat or loss on either side, but it introduced a new dimension to the relationship between former enemies. Angle 6. Gendered experience of defeat and recovery. Women occupied a central role in Japan's immediate post-war recovery. With many men absent due to death, imprisonment, or delayed repatriation, women managed households, secured food, and navigated administrative systems. They interacted with occupation authorities in markets, offices, and neighborhoods more frequently than in pre-war years. This shift placed them at the forefront of daily contact between civilians and occupying forces. The recovery of personal belongings often intersected with these responsibilities. Women searching for documents or photographs did so not only for sentimental reasons, but also for practical ones. Marriage records could affect access to ration cards or housing assignments. Family photographs preserved connections to relatives whose status remained uncertain. The act of reclaiming these items became part of the broader effort to rebuild family structures disrupted by war. Cultural expectations influenced how emotions were expressed during these interactions. Japanese society placed value on composure and restraint, particularly in public settings. Visible displays of emotion were often subtle. Tears quickly wiped away, a bowed head, a quiet expression of thanks through an interpreter. These gestures communicated relief or gratitude within the boundaries of social norms. Occupation authorities also paid attention to the role of women in shaping post-war society. Reforms introduced during the occupation expanded women's legal rights, including suffrage and changes to family law. While these reforms unfolded over time, the immediate post-war months already saw women taking on expanded public responsibilities. Their interactions with occupation personnel formed part of this evolving social landscape. Through these layered experiences, administrative, emotional, and cultural, the return of personal belongings became more than a simple logistical process. It intersected with broader transformations in Japanese society and with the gradual redefinition of relationships between civilians and occupation forces. These multiple angles, leadership policy, symbolic meaning, and gendered experience, converged in the early months of the occupation. Together, they set the stage for the period when uncertainty began to give way to a more structured and stable reality. By October 1945, the first phase of the occupation had moved beyond initial landings and into a more structured routine. American forces had secured major cities, established headquarters, and begun implementing policies aimed at stabilizing daily life. The fear that had followed surrender, of reprisals, unrest, or widespread resistance, had not materialized on the scale many had anticipated. Instead, a cautious coexistence emerged, shaped by necessity and regulation. Urban neighborhoods still bore the marks of destruction. In Tokyo, Yokohama, and Osaka, entire districts remained flattened months after the bombing raids. Debris clearance became a daily activity. Civilians sorted through rubble in search of usable materials. Temporary markets formed in open spaces where buildings had once stood. American patrols moved through these areas regularly, their presence becoming a familiar, if still foreign, element of the landscape. During this period, administrative systems handling lost and recovered property began functioning with greater consistency. Local offices, often operating out of partially damaged municipal buildings, organized items gathered during cleanup efforts. Civil defense teams, police units, and occupation personnel contributed to the process. Lists were compiled. Notices were posted. Civilians visited these offices in hopes of recovering documents or personal belongings. The turning point came not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of routine exchanges. As weeks passed, civilians grew more willing to approach administrative centers and interact with occupation personnel. Lines formed outside temporary offices where recovered items were displayed. The atmosphere remained quiet and formal. Yet the act of civilians voluntarily entering spaces overseen by occupying forces marked a shift from fear toward cautious engagement. American civil affairs officers observed these changes closely. Reports from the period noted the importance of maintaining predictable and respectful conduct. Stability depended not only on military control, but also on the gradual normalization of daily life. Each successful administrative exchange reinforced the perception that order was returning. The return of documents, tools, and personal objects became part of this broader stabilization. For civilians, these interactions offered moments of recognition amid upheaval. Identifying a familiar object among many others required patience and attention. Items were often damaged by heat or smoke. Names and addresses had to be matched carefully. Interpreters assisted when necessary, bridging language gaps that might otherwise have prevented identification. When a match was confirmed, the exchange was typically brief. A signature, a nod, a quiet acknowledgement. Then the civilians stepped back into the street, carrying a fragment of the past into a still uncertain present. These scenes unfolded across multiple cities and towns. In some places, the process was limited by the scale of destruction. In others, particularly where bombing had been less intense, more items survived to be returned. The pattern remained consistent, small administrative acts contributing to a gradual shift in perception. Civilians who once feared occupation troops now encountered them in controlled, procedural contexts. Soldiers who had expected hostility instead engaged in routine tasks that supported recovery. The psychological impact of these exchanges extended beyond individual families. They influenced the broader atmosphere of the occupation. Reports from late 1945 indicate that tensions in many urban areas eased as civilians observed the behavior of occupation forces. Strict discipline, predictable routines, and visible efforts to restore order helped reduce uncertainty. While resentment and hardship remained, the absence of widespread violence allowed for a different kind of adjustment. This turning point was subtle but significant. The war had ended abruptly in August, but the emotional and social transition required time. By October and November, patterns of interaction had begun to stabilize. Administrative processes, food distribution, housing assignments, property returns provided structured points of contact between civilians and occupiers. Each successful exchange reinforced the idea that the occupation, while foreign and authoritative, operated within defined rules. Winter approached. Fuel shortages made heating difficult. Food remained scarce. Yet administrative offices continued to function. Civilians returned repeatedly, searching for items lost during evacuations or bombing. Some visits ended in disappointment. Others resulted in the recovery of documents or photographs that had survived against expectation. For those who found such items, the moment often passed without outward display. Cultural norms encouraged composure, but the significance was clear. A photograph restored continuity. A certificate confirmed identity. These small recoveries signaled that life before the war had not vanished entirely. As the occupation entered its second month, these quiet interactions formed a foundation for the relationship between former enemies. They did not erase the realities of defeat or the challenges of reconstruction, but they introduced a measure of predictability into a landscape still marked by loss. And as administrative routines grew more consistent, the stage was set for a deeper transformation, one in which repeated, ordinary exchanges would gradually reshape perceptions on both sides. By the early winter of 1945, the occupation had entered a phase where routine replaced uncertainty. The initial weeks following surrender had been marked by tension and caution, but by November and December, a pattern of regulated daily life was taking hold in many Japanese cities. Municipal offices functioned with greater consistency. Public notices were posted regularly. Civilians learned where to go for information, supplies, and administrative needs. The machinery of governance, though altered, was operating again. Within this stabilizing environment, the process of returning recovered belongings reached its most active phase. Civil defense volunteers, local police, and occupation personnel continued to gather items uncovered during debris removal. Temporary storage areas were organized more systematically. In some districts, recovered documents and photographs were laid out for identification on tables inside municipal buildings. Lists of names and addresses, when legible, were recorded and posted. These procedures were modest in scale compared to the broader tasks of reconstruction, yet they carried symbolic weight. Each time a civilian identified a document or photograph, the exchange represented more than administrative efficiency. It signaled a gradual re-establishment of trust in predictable processes. For people who had experienced years of wartime disruption, the return of a personal item suggested that the new order, however foreign, operated within recognizable rules. The atmosphere in these offices remained restrained. Civilians approached carefully, often in silence. Interpreters mediated communication when needed. American personnel maintained professional distance, following regulations that emphasized discipline and respect for local customs. When an item was matched to its owner, the exchange was typically brief. A record was made. The object changed hands. The civilians stepped outside into streets still lined with rubble and temporary shelters. For many families, especially those led by women in the absence of male relatives, these moments carried layered meaning. A marriage certificate or photograph confirmed family ties at a time when many relatives remained missing or unaccounted for. In some cases, such documents were required for accessing ration cards or housing assistance. Their recovery had practical implications as well as emotional ones. Occupation reports from late 1945 and early 1946 noted the gradual easing of tensions between civilians and troops. Instances of open hostility were rare in most urban centers. Instead, interactions were characterized by formality and caution. Civilians adapted to the presence of foreign soldiers in their neighborhoods. Soldiers adjusted to duties that emphasized administration rather than combat. The shift did not erase the memory of war, but it changed the nature of daily encounters. Winter conditions added urgency to stabilization efforts. Cold weather intensified the challenges of housing and food distribution. Occupation authorities prioritized the restoration of utilities and transportation where possible. Local administrations worked to reopen schools and clinics. Amid these larger efforts, the return of personal belongings continued as part of the broader process of restoring normal routines. The turning point in perception emerged gradually. Early fears that occupation forces would act with unchecked severity gave way to recognition of regulated conduct. Civilians observed that soldiers followed orders and procedures. They saw administrative offices operating on schedules. They witnessed the return of items that had survived the destruction. These observations contributed to a cautious shift in attitudes. At the same time, American troops gained a clearer view of civilian conditions. Letters and reports from occupation personnel often mention the scale of urban devastation and the resilience of the population. Many soldiers had expected hostility or resistance. Instead, they encountered communities focused on rebuilding. This realization shaped how occupation duties were carried out at the local level. The broader strategic goals of the occupation, demilitarization, political reform, and economic recovery, remained central. Yet their success depended on daily interactions that established a sense of order. The return of personal belongings, though limited in scope, played a role in this process. It provided tangible evidence that administrative systems were functioning and that civilian life, however altered, could continue. By the end of 1945, the early phase of occupation had moved from uncertainty toward structured coexistence. Civilians navigated new systems while preserving elements of their past. Soldiers carried out duties that blended authority with administration. The exchanges that took place in municipal offices and damaged neighborhoods became part of the foundation on which post-war recovery would be built. The climax of this period was not a single dramatic event, but the cumulative effect of these interactions. The return of documents and photographs did not transform the broader realities of defeat or reconstruction. Yet it marked a shift in the everyday relationship between former enemies. Through repeated, regulated exchanges, a new pattern of interaction emerged, one that allowed both sides to move cautiously from war toward a fragile peace. And as winter deepened and the occupation settled into longer-term routines, attention began to turn from immediate stabilization to the lasting consequences these early months would leave behind. By early 1946, more than 3 months had passed since Japan's surrender, and the initial phase of the occupation was giving way to longer-term reconstruction. Civilians had begun to re-establish routines. Streets once filled with rubble now hosted temporary markets, while repaired buildings provided shelter and spaces for daily life. Though material conditions remained difficult, food shortages, fuel scarcity, and damaged infrastructure persisted. The return of personal belongings in municipal offices symbolized the slow restoration of societal order. The occupation's impact on Japanese civilians was immediate and multifaceted. Women, who had borne much of the domestic burden in the absence of men, continued to manage households, ration food, and track family records. Documents recovered from storage, marriage certificates, birth records, and photographs helped facilitate practical needs, such as securing ration cards or confirming identity with local authorities. These objects also carried emotional weight, representing continuity with life before the war and evidence that, despite destruction, some elements of family and memory had endured. American occupation forces remained a visible presence. Military police patrolled streets. Civil affairs officers visited neighborhoods to assist with housing, distribution, and administrative questions. Reports from this period note that civilians generally complied with regulations, though they did so cautiously. Early fears of reprisal had faded, replaced by a recognition that orderly behavior was necessary to secure scarce resources and maintain access to local services. The gradual normalization of daily life was reinforced by small administrative acts. The return of photographs or other personal belongings became one of many routine interactions that helped civilians adapt to occupation authority. While these exchanges were not dramatic, they carried symbolic significance. Each recovered item reaffirmed a sense of continuity and control amid a society reshaped by defeat. For many women, these exchanges were particularly meaningful. With their roles expanded in the post-war household, they often took responsibility for securing documents, ration cards, and other vital materials for their families. The act of recovering a photograph or certificate was intertwined with broader responsibilities, preserving memory, confirming identity, and maintaining the household's legal and social standing. Even minor items, like letters or small keepsakes, serve as anchors in a rapidly changing world. The practical benefits of returned property extended beyond immediate household needs. Marriage certificates, birth records, and family registers were essential for accessing municipal services, including healthcare, education, and food distribution. Photographs, while not legally required, provided proof of family connections and could assist in tracing relatives displaced by the war. As administrative systems stabilized, access to these items allowed civilians to navigate the emerging bureaucratic landscape with greater confidence. At the same time, the occupation had a broader psychological impact. Civilians witnessed foreign soldiers adhering to predictable routines and regulations. For the first time, many encountered authority that was professional, disciplined, and structured rather than coercive or violent. Repeated interactions in municipal offices and public spaces built familiarity. These small, everyday contacts contributed to a cautious recalibration of trust, even in a society still adjusting to defeat. Local officials and civil affairs officers played a key role in mediating these exchanges. Japanese municipal employees coordinated with occupation personnel to identify recovered items and notify residents. Their presence helped bridge cultural and linguistic gaps, ensuring that documents were correctly returned and that civilians could navigate the new administrative environment. This collaboration contributed to a sense that occupation authorities were working within recognizable rules, not acting arbitrarily. Yet recovery was incomplete. Many homes had been destroyed beyond repair, and a significant portion of personal property had been lost permanently. For civilians in heavily bombed cities, the return of a single document or photograph could represent the only surviving connection to a pre-war life. In less damaged districts, larger collections of items could be returned, providing a more complete sense of continuity. Across regions, the variability in recovery highlighted the uneven impact of the war and the occupation. By the spring of 1946, civilians were adapting to these conditions. Streets were cleared, markets functioned more reliably, and municipal offices maintained regular schedules for document retrieval. American occupation forces continued to supervise operations and enforce regulations, but the immediate fear that had characterized the first weeks after surrender had diminished. The cumulative effect of administrative routines and property return programs contributed to a gradual stabilization of urban and rural life. The first months of 1946 set the stage for broader societal transformation. Women's roles expanded, administrative systems became standardized, and interaction with occupation forces became part of ordinary life. The seemingly small act of returning personal belongings, documents, letters, photographs, form an understated but critical bridge between the devastation of war and the reconstruction of society. As 1946 progressed, the Japanese occupation entered a phase of consolidation. The initial focus on immediate stabilization, restoring order, securing property, and maintaining essential services, shifted toward longer-term reconstruction and reform. Civilians who had endured years of war now faced the challenge of rebuilding lives in a radically transformed society. The administrative routines established in the first months of occupation continued to provide structure, and small acts, such as the return of personal belongings, retained symbolic significance. Recovered documents, photographs, and other personal items became essential tools for navigating the new social and legal landscape. Marriage certificates, family registries, and identification papers were necessary for accessing housing, healthcare, and ration distribution. Photographs and letters, meanwhile, offered continuity with the past, a tangible connection to family, heritage, and pre-war life. For women managing households, these items were vital. They affirmed authority within the family unit, enabled practical decision-making, and preserved the memory of relatives lost or displaced during the conflict. The impact of these returns extended beyond individual households. Across towns and cities, neighborhoods witnessed similar exchanges. Collective recognition that administrative systems functioned reliably fostered trust in local governance. Civilians observed that occupation forces, despite being foreign and uniformed, operated according to predictable rules. This perception reduced tension and contributed to a broader acceptance of occupation authority. Occupation records from 1946 indicate that civilians often expressed quiet relief at the return of personal items. While cultural norms limited overt displays of emotion, even restrained gestures, such as a bowed head, careful handling of a photograph, or subdued thanks through an interpreter, signaled the significance of these moments. For many, the survival and return of belongings became a subtle marker of hope in a society coping with loss, scarcity, and the psychological aftermath of defeat. At the same time, the occupation catalyzed broader societal changes. Legal reforms expanded women's rights, including suffrage and changes to family law. Educational and social programs aimed to dismantle militaristic structures and encourage democratic participation. Within this evolving context, the recovery of personal property reinforced the continuity of civilian life. It allowed families to maintain social and legal structures that formed the foundation for post-war society. The cumulative effect of these interactions, routine, procedural, and seemingly minor, shaped the early perception of occupation. Civilians began to differentiate between the destructive forces of wartime and the regulated, administrative presence of occupation troops. Soldiers, in turn, observed firsthand the resilience and adaptation of civilian populations. These repeated, ordinary exchanges became foundational to the slow normalization of life under occupation. By mid-1946, Japanese cities and towns displayed a fragile but observable stability. Markets functioned more consistently. Schools reopened in temporary or repaired buildings, and municipal offices maintained organized systems for civil affairs. While shortages and structural damage persisted, the return of documents, photographs, and personal items contributed to a sense of continuity in daily life. It offered civilians a tangible measure of regained agency, even amid the broader constraints of occupation. These months of aftermath demonstrated that Reconstruction was not solely physical or political. It was deeply human. The restoration of personal items, marriage certificates, letters, photographs, symbolized a reconciliation between the past and the emerging post-war order. They became markers of resilience, of memory preserved despite widespread destruction. Through these incremental, procedural acts, civilians reclaimed fragments of life disrupted by war, laying the foundation for Japan's gradual recovery. And as these patterns stabilized, attention increasingly turned from immediate survival toward the broader questions of societal transformation, memory, and the enduring impact of occupation on Japanese life. The return of personal belongings, photographs, letters, certificates, may seem modest against the vast scale of wartime destruction. Yet these small objects carried extraordinary weight. They represented continuity, memory, and identity in a society that had been uprooted by firebombing, displacement, and defeat. For civilians, particularly women managing households in the absence of men, these recovered items were tangible anchors in a world where familiar structures had been shattered. The occupation of Japan was not merely a military or political endeavor. It was a human experiment in governance, reconstruction, and reconciliation. The disciplined, procedural approach of occupation forces allowed civilians to begin interacting with authority without fear of arbitrary violence. Each document returned, each photograph handed back, was a quiet reinforcement of order, predictability, and the possibility of life resuming, even amid ruins. These exchanges illuminate a broader truth about the aftermath of conflict. While wars are often measured in territory gained or lives lost, the restoration of ordinary life depends on subtler acts. The recovery of property, the recognition of family identity, the careful rebuilding of routines. In post-war Japan, these seemingly minor acts became crucial threads in the fabric of social and cultural recovery. Moreover, these interactions reveal the complex human dimension of occupation. Civilians confronted the reality of foreign authority, negotiating fear, gratitude, and practicality within their daily lives. Soldiers, in turn, witnessed resilience, endurance, and the quiet dignity of those who had survived devastation. Through these moments, the boundaries between former enemies were redefined, not through conquest, but through administration, respect, and shared necessity. In the broader sweep of history, the recovery of personal belongings during the occupation may appear minor. Yet for those who receive them, they symbolize survival, memory, and continuity. They remind us that in the shadow of immense destruction, the preservation of ordinary human life, the small rituals, the photographs, the records, is both an act of dignity and a bridge toward a fragile but enduring peace. In these exchanges, the story of post-war Japan is told not only through military occupation or political reform, but through the quiet persistence of memory, the resilience of ordinary civilians, and the simple, human reclamation of a life interrupted by war.